Hey guys, welcome back to the Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled people story. I've been debating whether to share this story for months now, but after what happened last week, I figure you guys might get a kick out of it. This is about how someone tried to use their social power to humiliate me, and how I ended up in a position to completely flip the script on them. Some background first. I'm 45, and I run a custom home construction and renovation company. Started it from nothing about 15 years ago, and now we do high-end work throughout the state. I'm not flashy about money, but the business has done well enough that I can afford the finer things. One of those things was my membership at a golf resort about 20 minutes from my house. The place is called, well, let's just call it the resort. It's one of those fancy complexes that has everything. Golf course, hotel, restaurant, spa, and a whole residential community attached to it. I'd been a full golf member there for 12 years, paying about 15 grand a year in dues. Used it for business lunches, entertaining clients, and just personal relaxation when I needed to decompress. My daily driver is a Ford F-250 Platinum. Not just any work truck. This thing cost me north of $90,000. It's pristine, has every luxury option you can think of, and yes, it has a small, tasteful logo for my company on the doors. Nothing flashy, just professional looking. I've driven it to the resort hundreds of times over the years without a single issue. Now, let me tell you about the woman who would become my nemesis. She's in her 50s, married to money, and has appointed herself the unofficial queen of the resort's social scene. For the sake of this story, let's call her the Queen Bee. She runs something called the Social and Aesthetics Committee, and is basically the head of the Homeowners Association for the residential part of the complex. You know the type. Everything has to be perfect according to her vision, and God help you if you don't fit her idea of what belongs there. The Queen Bee had always been polite but cold to me. I got the sense she saw me as new money, someone who worked with his hands, not quite the right sort of person for her precious club. But for 12 years, we'd coexisted just fine. She'd give me tight smiles, I'd nod politely, and we'd both go about our business. What I didn't know was that for the past 6 months, I'd been involved in something that would completely change the power dynamic between us. See, the resort was in financial trouble. The parent company had over-leveraged themselves during an expansion a few years back, and they were quietly looking for investors. Through a business contact, I'd been approached about joining a small group of investors who were putting together a deal to buy a 40% controlling stake in the entire operation. The other investors wanted me specifically because of my construction and operations background. The resort needed serious renovations, and they wanted someone who could oversee that work while also having a financial stake in the success of the place. I'd been in quiet negotiations and due diligence for months, but kept it completely confidential. Nobody at the resort knew about any of this. The whole thing started on a Friday in early spring. I'd had a brutal week with 2 major projects hitting crunch time, and I was looking forward to an afternoon on the golf course. I had a 3 o'clock tee time with a potential client, one of those meetings where you talk business between holes and hopefully close a deal by the 18th green. I'd been to 2 job sites that morning, so my truck was perfectly clean but clearly a working vehicle. I pulled into the members' parking lot like I had 1,000 times before and headed toward the clubhouse. The Queen Bee was holding court on the main patio with her usual group of followers, all of them nursing glasses of wine despite it being early afternoon. As I walked past their table, I heard the Queen Bee make this very loud, very performative sigh. She said something like, "I just don't understand why management allows service vehicles in the main lot. It's so tacky, it completely ruins the aesthetic we're trying to maintain here." I was in a good mood, so I just nodded in her direction and said, "Afternoon," and kept walking. She made this disgusted scoff and literally turned her back to me. Her little group all murmured in agreement, like I'd somehow personally offended them by existing. I should have known right then that she'd decided to make me her project. I'd been parking that truck in that same lot for 12 years without a single complaint from anyone who actually mattered. But the Queen Bee had apparently decided that my vehicle was beneath the standards of her personal kingdom. The golf meeting went great, by the way. Closed a $2 million renovation deal between the 7th and 8th holes. I remember thinking what a perfect day it was turning out to be. If only I'd known what the Queen Bee was planning. About a week later, I was heading to the club for dinner. They have this amazing restaurant, and I'd made a reservation to meet an old friend who was in town. I pulled up to the front gate like always, but instead of waving me through, the security guard stopped me. This kid couldn't have been more than 22, and he looked absolutely terrified. He came up to my window and said, "Sir, I'm really sorry, but I can't let this vehicle onto the property. We've had complaints about commercial trucks in the members area." I was polite, but firm. Told him I'd been a member for 12 years, this was my personal vehicle, and I had a dinner reservation in 10 minutes. The poor kid was clearly in way over his head. He kept looking at his radio like he wanted to call for backup but wasn't sure what to say. That's when the queen bee appeared. She came walking out of the clubhouse with her little purse dog, timing it perfectly like she'd been watching from inside. She walked right up to the guard and said, "Oh, is there a problem here, Kyle?" Then she turned to me with this fake sweet smile and said, "OP, dear, we've discussed this before. Your truck just isn't appropriate for the main areas. Perhaps you could park in the overflow lot by the highway." Now, I'm generally a pretty calm guy. You have to be in my business. But something about her tone just hit me wrong. She was talking to me like I was a contractor who'd shown up at the wrong entrance, not a member who'd been paying dues since before this kid was old enough to drive. I looked right at her and said, "With all due respect, my truck pays the same 5-figure annual dues as your husband's Mercedes. I'm parking in the members' lot." Then I put my window up and drove slowly past the fumbling guard. In my rearview mirror, I could see the queen bee standing there with her face turning red, probably angrier than she'd been in years. This was the first time anyone had publicly challenged her authority in her own domain, and she was not going to let it slide. I should have realized that this wasn't over. The queen bee didn't have any real official power over club management. The resort was owned by a parent company, and the actual board of directors were corporate people who lived 3 states away and couldn't care less about parking lot politics. But she did have influence over the on-site general manager, a weak-willed guy I'll call Davies. Davies had been the GM for about 3 years, and from what I could tell, his main qualification was his willingness to keep the local power brokers happy. He was the kind of guy who would agree with whoever was in the room at the moment, and the queen bee had apparently decided he was her personal tool for enforcing her vision of how things should be. 2 days later, I got an email from Davies that I'll never forget. It was cold and formal, completely different from every other interaction I'd had with club management over the years. The subject line said, "Member Review," and the message basically said that following a review by the Social and Aesthetics Committee and multiple member complaints regarding conduct unbecoming and violation of club decorum, my membership was suspended effective immediately, pending a full board review. I read that email 3 times before it really sank in. They were kicking me out. After 12 years of membership, tens of thousands in annual dues, and never so much as a noise complaint, they were suspending me because the queen bee didn't like my truck. I called the club immediately and asked to speak to Davies. The receptionist put me on hold for 10 minutes, then came back and said he was unavailable and would get back to me. He never did. I tried calling the parent company and got shuffled around between different departments, none of whom seemed to know anything about my situation. It was clear that this was being handled at the local level, and the queen bee had gotten exactly what she wanted. About a week later, I was having lunch with another club member who filled me in on what had been happening behind the scenes. Apparently, the queen bee had been bragging about her victory. She'd been telling people at the 19th hole that she'd finally cleaned up the place and gotten that construction guy kicked out. She kept saying it was about standards and maintaining the proper atmosphere. I was furious, obviously, but I was also a strategist. I'd built my business by thinking several moves ahead, and I wasn't about to let this slide. The thing was, I had information that the queen bee didn't. While she was busy celebrating her social victory, I was about 48 hours away from a phone call that would completely change the power structure of her little kingdom. You see, the investment deal I'd been working on was about to close. The final call with our group's attorneys was scheduled for Thursday, and by Friday we'd own a controlling stake in the entire resort. The queen bee thought she'd cut me out of her world, but she had no idea that I was about to become her boss. My board review was going to be a little different than she imagined. For the next 2 months, I played what I call the quiet game. I didn't fight the suspension. I didn't make a scene. I just disappeared from the resort completely and let the queen bee have her victory. As far as she knew, her little power play had worked perfectly. Behind the scenes, though, everything was moving forward with the acquisition. The due diligence was completed, the financing was arranged, and the parent company was thrilled to get the cash infusion they desperately needed. By late June, our investor group owned a 40% controlling stake in the entire operation. The first thing we did was form a new executive committee to oversee the local management. Given my background in construction and operations, I was immediately appointed as the chair of operations and vendor relations. Basically, I was now responsible for overseeing every aspect of how the resort actually functioned on a day-to-day basis. My first request to the committee was for a comprehensive audit of all existing vendor contracts. I told them we were bleeding cash and needed to see every landscaping, food service, and maintenance agreement. Everything was going out to bid, and we were going to find out exactly where our money was going. What I found was exactly what I expected. The queen bee's husband ran a landscaping company, and somehow they'd managed to secure a contract that was about 40% above market rate. Even better, the contract included various consulting fees and premium charges that looked suspiciously like kickbacks for whoever had approved the deal. The work itself was mediocre at best. I'd been looking at those grounds for 12 years as a member, and while they weren't terrible, they certainly weren't worth what we were paying. I had 3 other landscaping companies submit bids, and every single one came in significantly lower with better service packages. It was a textbook example of the kind of local politics that happen when you have weak management and strong personalities with personal agendas. Davies had obviously approved this deal to keep the Queen Bee happy, regardless of what it cost the club. 3 months after my suspension, it was time to make my reappearance. I chose a Wednesday morning when I knew the club would be relatively quiet. I drove my truck and parked it directly in front of the clubhouse, right in the spot reserved for the general manager. Then I got out, straightened my tie, and walked through the front doors like I owned the place, which, technically, I now did. The receptionist saw me coming and her face went completely white. She started stammering something about how I couldn't be there and how she needed to call security. Before she could finish, Davies came rushing out of his office looking like he'd seen a ghost. "OP," he said, practically shouting, "I must ask you to leave immediately. You are trespassing on private property." That's when my 2 partners from the investment group walked in behind me. One of them, a distinguished-looking guy in his 60s, walked right up to Davies and introduced himself. "Good morning, Mr. Davies. I'm Mr. Johnson from the new executive committee. This is our partner, OP. As of 9 o'clock this morning, we are your new oversight committee, and our first order of business is a comprehensive performance review. Yours starts right now. Please bring us all vendor contracts, especially anything related to landscaping services." I wish I could have taken a picture of Davies' face in that moment. It went through about 5 different expressions in the span of 10 seconds. Confusion, recognition, terror, and then this pathetic attempt at a smile as he realized his entire world had just shifted. We spent the next 2 hours in his office going through every contract and expense report from the past 3 years. Davies, obviously trying to save his job, suddenly became very cooperative. He agreed that many of the vendor relationships seemed overpriced, and that we should definitely get new bids for everything. When we got to the landscaping contract, I laid out the numbers for him. I showed him the 3 competitive bids I'd already obtained, each one significantly lower than what we were currently paying. I explained that the current contract appeared to include several questionable fees and charges that didn't seem to correspond to actual work being performed. Davies immediately threw the landscaping company under the bus. He said he'd always had concerns about that particular contract, but hadn't felt he had the authority to make changes. He assured us that he would terminate the agreement immediately and begin the process of bringing in new vendors. 1 week later, I was back on the golf course for the first time in 3 months. I'd invited the same client I was supposed to meet the day I got banned, and we'd had a great round. As I was walking back toward the clubhouse, I could see the Queen Bee holding court on the main patio with her usual group of admirers. She spotted me from about 50 yards away, and I watched her face go through a series of expressions. First confusion, like she couldn't quite process what she was seeing. Then recognition as it dawned on her that the person she'd had banned was walking across her precious golf course. Finally, pure rage as she realized someone had clearly made a mistake and let me back in. She stood up from her table, probably preparing to march over and demand that security remove me immediately. I could practically see her rehearsing her speech about how unacceptable it was that band members were being allowed back on the property. That's when Davies came running out of the clubhouse like his life depended on it. "OP, Mr. OP," he called out, practically jogging across the patio. "So good to see you back on the course. How did everything play today? Is the new groundskeeping team meeting your standards? Can I get you a drink? Anything you want, completely on the house?" He was practically falling over himself to shake my hand and ask about my experience. It was the kind of fawning attention usually reserved for celebrities or heads of state. Every word out of his mouth made it more obvious that something fundamental had changed about my status at the club. I just smiled, thanked him for asking, and told him the course had played beautifully. Then I looked past him and made direct eye contact with the Queen Bee. She was frozen in place, still halfway standing from her chair, her mouth slightly open like she'd forgotten how to close it. I could literally see her brain trying to process what she was witnessing. The general manager was treating the man she'd had banned like he was the most important person at the club. In that single moment, she understood that her little social kingdom had just crumbled around her. All the influence she thought she had, all the power she'd wielded through whispered conversations and social pressure meant absolutely nothing when faced with actual financial ownership. I gave her a polite nod and a small, satisfied smile. I didn't need to say anything. She knew. Her husband's landscaping contract would be terminated by the end of the day, Davies would never again take her calls seriously, and her reign as the unofficial queen of the resort was officially over. I turned back to Davies and mentioned that the new landscaping work looked good, but suggested some improvements to the area around the 10th hole. As I walked toward the clubhouse, the only sound from the queen bee's table was the nervous clinking of ice and untouched drinks. But that wasn't the end of it. What happened over the next few weeks was even more satisfying than that initial moment of recognition. The queen bee apparently spent the first few days after my reappearance trying to figure out what had happened. She started making calls to people she thought might have influence, trying to understand how someone who'd been banned could suddenly be back and treated like royalty. What she discovered, probably through her husband when his landscaping contract was formally terminated, was that I wasn't just back as a member, I was essentially her new landlord. The residential part of the resort where the queen bee lived and ruled over her homeowners association was all part of the same parent company we'd just bought into. Her little kingdom was actually just one small piece of a much larger operation, and that operation now answered to people like me. The first change we implemented was a restructuring of the relationship between the various components of the resort. The hotel, golf course, restaurant, and residential areas had all been operating somewhat independently, but we wanted better coordination and oversight. This meant that the homeowners association, which the queen bee ran like her personal fiefdom, now had to report to the main executive committee for any major decisions or expenditures. The queen bee tried to fight this, of course. She called meetings, sent letters, and generally made a lot of noise about property rights and association independence. But when your mortgage is ultimately held by the same entity that owns everything else, your options are limited. The lawyers made it very clear that the new structure was both legal and binding. Even better, one of the first things we discovered during our operational audit was that the homeowners association had been operating with some questionable financial practices. Nothing illegal, but definitely things that wouldn't hold up to professional scrutiny. Expense reports that were vague, contractors being paid without proper bidding processes, and maintenance fees that seemed to disappear into undefined categories. We brought in professional management consultants to review the association's operations and make recommendations for improvement. The queen bee was welcome to stay on as a volunteer coordinator, but all actual authority would now rest with professional staff who answered to the main resort management. I have to admit, watching her realize that she was being systematically stripped of every bit of power and influence she'd built up over the years was incredibly satisfying. She tried to rally her supporters, but when it became clear that opposing the new management structure might actually affect their property values, most people decided they'd rather stay on good terms with the new ownership. The final blow came about a month after I'd returned to the club. The new landscaping company we'd hired was doing excellent work at a fraction of the previous cost, and the grounds were looking better than they had in years. The queen bee's husband, meanwhile, was apparently struggling to replace the income from the contract he'd lost. I was having lunch on the patio when I saw the queen bee walking through with a real estate agent. She was showing him around the residential area and asking questions about market values and selling procedures. It was pretty obvious that she was at least considering putting her house on the market, whether it was because they couldn't afford the mortgage without the landscaping contract, or because she couldn't stand living somewhere she no longer had any influence, or just because she was too embarrassed to face the daily reminder of how thoroughly she'd been outmaneuvered. I wasn't sure. But it was clear that her time as the queen of the resort was coming to an end. A few weeks later, I heard through the grapevine that she and her husband had decided to relocate to a community about an hour away. Apparently, they'd found a place where her particular style of social management might be better appreciated. I never saw the queen bee again after that day with the real estate agent, but I heard she'd moved out quietly sometime in early fall. No big farewell parties, no dramatic speeches about the changing character of the community. She just packed up and left. And suddenly, the resort was a much more relaxed and welcoming place. The whole experience taught me something important about the difference between real power and social influence. For years, the queen bee had been able to get her way through force of personality, social pressure, and the willingness of weak managers to appease her rather than deal with conflict. She'd built what felt like an unassailable position based on nothing more than other people's desire to avoid confrontation. But when that came up against actual ownership and financial control, it crumbled immediately. All her influence disappeared the moment it became clear that she couldn't actually affect the things that mattered. Property values, management decisions, vendor contracts, operational procedures. All of that was now controlled by people who didn't care about her social standing or her opinions about aesthetics. 6 months later, the resort is running better than it ever has. The new management structure has eliminated a lot of the petty politics and personal favoritism that had been dragging the place down. Vendor contracts are awarded based on actual performance and competitive bidding. The Homeowners Association operates with professional oversight and transparent financial practices. And perhaps most importantly, members are treated based on their actual status as paying customers rather than their perceived social standing. I still drive my truck to the club, and I still park it wherever is most convenient. Davies, who kept his job but learned to focus on actual management rather than local politics, always makes sure I'm well taken care of. The new groundskeeping company has the place looking spectacular, and the cost savings from competitive vendor contracts have allowed us to make improvements that were desperately needed. But the most satisfying part isn't the money I saved or the improvements we've made. It's the knowledge that when someone tried to use their social influence to humiliate me and exclude me from something I'd paid for and earned, I was able to respond in the one language that really matters. I didn't fight her on her terms, using gossip and social pressure and committee politics. I fought her with actual ownership and financial control, and I won decisively. The queen bee thought she was teaching me a lesson about knowing my place. Instead, she learned a much more valuable lesson about the difference between having influence and having power. And in the end, I taught her the most important lesson of all. I came out on top. The funny thing is, about 6 months after everything settled down, I ran into Davies at a business conference in the city. He was there representing the resort, which was now being recognized as one of the best managed facilities in the region. When he saw me, he came right over with this huge grin. He told me that the changes we'd implemented had completely turned the place around. Member satisfaction was at an all-time high, operational costs were down almost 30%, and they were actually booking more events than they could handle. The professional management of the Homeowners Association had eliminated most of the petty complaints and drama that used to consume so much of his time. But what really made me smile was when he mentioned that several longtime members had commented on how much more welcoming and relaxed the atmosphere had become. Apparently, without the queen bee's constant policing of who belonged and who didn't, people were actually enjoying themselves more. Davies said something that stuck with me. He told me that he'd learned the difference between managing a business and managing personalities, and how much easier his job became once he focused on the former instead of the latter. A year later, the resort was featured in a regional business magazine as a model for successful hospitality management. The article talked about how a strategic investment in operational overhaul had transformed a struggling facility into a premier destination. They interviewed some of the new investors, including me, about our approach to improving both financial performance and customer experience. I kept the article framed in my office, not because I needed the recognition, but because it reminded me of something important. Sometimes when people try to knock you down using their little sphere of influence, the best response isn't to fight them on their level. Sometimes you just have to step up to a level where their influence doesn't matter anymore. The queen bee probably thought she was putting me in my place that day she had me banned. What she actually did was teach me that there's always a bigger game being played, and if you're smart enough and patient enough, you can usually find a way to win it. I still play golf at the resort every week. My truck still gets parked wherever I want. And every time I walk past that patio where the queen bee used to hold court, I remember the most important business lesson I ever learned. In the end, the person who controls the money controls everything else. Everything else is just noise. The next one is a malicious compliance story. This happened to me a while back, but just came back to me. I used to work for an armored car company, something I did for a few years when I was in university and waiting for a position in what would be my future career. It was good money and lots of people did it as their full-time jobs, but I wanted more out of life than a mindless job. Because I was classified as part-time, I did not have a set shift. I mostly covered for people when they were sick, took vacation, worked unscheduled shifts, or worked shifts created specifically for part-timers. All in all, I was working full-time hours almost every week. Most of the full-timers loved working with me. The way the company worked, you were set for a 13-hour shift. However, if you managed to complete your run as less than that, you'd still get paid the full shift. I was young, moved fast, and didn't care about breaks if it meant I could get paid for 3-4 hours to sit at home instead of working. So, whenever I took over for someone older who was just on autopilot, I could get their coworker home in a fraction of the time. One of the full-time workers, a real Karen, let's call him Kyle, was just the worst. For some reason, he took it upon himself to tattle on people for anything that he didn't like. If someone weren't wearing their collared shirt under their sweater, run to tell management. FYI, working in the summer heat in a literal metal box wearing a bulletproof vest makes you want to shed layers. Someone wearing black instead of blue pants tells management. Someone wearing a company hat that has the company logo but is not official uniform tells management. No one in the company liked Kyle. Well, one week Kyle's coworker has taken vacation, and my boss schedules me to replace him. The run is pretty easy. It's commercial day shift, so 90% of the stops are retail stores with less than a few $100 in cash. Because of the amount of money, no one has ever had a problem with one person jumping out and running in, grabbing the money and coming back, while the second person, usually the driver, stays with the truck. In this shift, I was the driver, so that's what I did. When Kyle was in the store, I would just navigate my phone, look at the people in the area, make sure there were no threats, make sure I wasn't parked in anyone's way, mostly wasting time. Well, one stop, Kyle came back and I was just finishing up writing an email. Apparently, Kyle wasn't too happy with me taking a few extra seconds to start going. To unbeknownst to me took a picture of me behind the wheel on my phone. I had no idea until the next shift came the next day, where management came to talk to me about texting and driving. I told them I had no idea what they were talking about, and my manager just said that he had proof I was doing it, and if I did it again, I would be written up. I went to talk to another coworker who is also the union rep to figure out what the hell was going on, and he told me Kyle took a picture of me yesterday and complained that I was doing it. I was pissed. Cue malicious compliance. My shifts with Kyle were 3 13-hour shifts. Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. Well, today was now Thursday, our last shift of this run, and this shift was not retail pickups. It was the run that takes all the money collected from the previous week and brings it to our provincial depot about 400 kilometers away. The entire run only has about 30 mins of work and about 9 hours of driving. If you did the math, this is one of those runs where if you get it done quickly, if traffic is on your side, you can get paid for a lot of unworked time. It was also the last shift of the week, which meant a long, gorgeous weekend in the middle of summer as soon as we were done. Well, I was going to make sure this shift lasted as long as possible. If he didn't want me to break any rules, I'd make sure I obliged. I drove exactly the speed limit the entire way. I even stopped for our 1-hour lunch break, which is given to us, but I had not witnessed anyone take in the years I'd been here because of the rules we had about pay. In fact, we were so behind, we reached the major city our depot was located in right at rush hour, something our early start time was designed to prevent. All in all, what should have taken about 9 hours to do ended up taking 14. An extra 5 hours where he just had to sit there and watch me in silence. To make things sweeter, a few times during the shift he had to call his wife and let he know he wouldn't be home early enough to go to the cottage and they would have to leave the next day instead. I heard from other workers how furious he was and how I'd ruined his plans for the weekend, and all I could do was smile. To clarify, where I live, going 15 to 20 kilometers per h above the speed limit is standard. Going to speed limit will just get someone smashing into your rear bumper. Also, our trucks have a max speed of 105 kilometers per h, and most of the drive is either 80 kilometers per h or 100 kilometers per h. The next one is an entitled people story. I live and work in a bougie tourist town in the USA. One of my jobs is private driving, mainly taking people around in an Escalade to wineries and fancy restaurants. The car is my boss's. It's rented out by the hour. You get the idea. Anyways, the other night I was dropping a mother and daughter off at their hotel around 11:30 p.m. The customers I drove were absolutely lovely people. I had been driving them since 9:30 that morning and had a very nice time taking them around the area. I asked if there was anything else they needed, said goodnight, and made sure they were inside the building before getting back into the car. As I'm buckling my seatbelt, I realize that someone is staring at me from outside the car. I make the unfortunate mistake of looking up and make eye contact with this well-dressed lady standing with a group of other people in formal wear, probably in her 30s, through the passenger window. I do the customer service smile and nod and then refocus my attention to getting the car started and getting the hell home. Suddenly there is banging on my passenger side window. I look back over and this lady is smacking the window open-handed like a toddler. I can only assume she is an inebriated wedding guest as there was a wedding at the resort that evening. I roll down the window mostly to get her to stop, and partially because I was startled and wondering what the hell was going on. Me. Passive-aggressive customer service voice. Hi! Do you need something? Lady. Can you give me a ride? Mind you, this is a 4-star resort, very posh, in a very pricey tourist town. There are at least 2 bell people about 10 feet away, not to mention the front desk staff inside. She could have easily procured help with securing transportation, whether it be Uber or a taxi or a private driver. The service I'm hired for is always scheduled at least a week in advance. It's a small high-end company and is definitely not a ride service. The vehicle I drive is not marked besides legal licensing numbers, so my brief interaction with my passengers was the only reason she had any idea I was hired to drive. Me. I'm so sorry, but I am a private driver and I'm not authorized to allow unscheduled passengers in the vehicle. I'm sure the hotel staff would be more than happy to help you arrange transportation. Lady scowls and looks taken back. That's stupid. Ugh, whatever. She turned back to her friend, and as I was rolling up the window, I heard this lady mocking me to her friend, I am a private driver. I can't take you. I just rolled my eyes and drove away. The window was up, and I know better than to engage with stupid, especially when combined with intoxication. But still, I could have been a guest at the hotel, dropping the rest of the group off. I could have raised a big stink about it. Hell, I could have been ill with gun fever and escalated everything. Obviously, I didn't because she didn't actually harm the car, and honestly, I was tired and just wanted to get home after a long day, but still, the entitlement of it all. Anyway, thank you for watching.